There is a modest, terrible reason a dozen of Robertson County's wealthiest families changed their names between 1847 and 1860. For more than 20 years, they had held the county's courts, its banks, its best bottomland, as if their control were a natural law. Then, between those years, 12 family names were quietly abandoned. People vanished across 4 states, some as far as Texas and Missouri. And what propelled that flight was not pestilence or market collapse or war. It was a woman. Her name was Eliza Harwell. She was born in a cabin behind a brick mansion with one blue eye and one brown. In 1824, that kind of mark carried the old country's superstitions. It suggested second sight, a gaze that took in more than most. But superstition had nothing to do with the ruin that followed. What destroyed 12 families was not witchcraft. It was what Eliza remembered, how she understood power, and the single, terrible choice she would one day make when the chance came to speak. Robertson County in the 1820s was a place of green tobacco and a river that cut through centuries of displaced lives. Springfield's courthouse and the merchants' homes shone with the wealth that had been purchased by forced labor. Polite society simply tacitly learned not to look too long at how that wealth was made. Soil and season favored a wealthy few, landowners who did more than plant crops. They made law, they set credit, they decided futures. The Harwell plantation sat on 800 acres of rich bottomland, run by Colonel James Harwell. He had inherited the property in 1819 and spent the next 5 years expanding his holdings and influence. He served as magistrate, kept friends in Nashville's political circles, and entertained men whose deals never left the parlor. The house itself was competent and severe, brick, timber, a porch that caught evening breezes, and behind it the plantation's machinery. Tobacco barns, curing sheds, a blacksmith's forge, a weaving house, and 2 rows of cabins where the 73 enslaved people lived and worked. On a March morning in 1824, a child was born in that cabin row, delivered by Ruth, the midwife who had seen 3 generations come into the world. Ruth had watched twins and stillborns and miracles. She had not seen eyes quite like these. One was a winter sky gray, luminous and flat. The other a dark, almost black-brown. The medical term, heterochromia iridis, would have meant nothing to most of the county. What they had were stories, and stories bend into superstition so quickly among people who live by rumor. Ruth held the infant a moment, then said quietly, "Child got different eyes. Seen it once before, long time ago. That child lived to be old. Nothing wrong with her, just different." Sarah, the baby's mother, watched Ruth wrap the child and saw hesitation in the old woman's hands. A furtive glance toward the door, a small tremor. Sarah had survived the middle passage and learned to read fear by its smallest signs. She named the girl Eliza, a name lifted from Bible readings, and resolved, fiercely and quietly, to raise her as normal as they could manage in a world bent to deny anything resembling normalcy to people like them. For the first 6 years, the plan held. The other children accepted Eliza once the novelty of her eyes wore off. She played, ate, learned the essential lessons of survival and silence. The white children kept their distance. Parents warned them with old superstitions about mismatched eyes and bad luck. Eliza, though, was different in a way that had nothing to do with folk belief. She remembered. Memory arrived in her like a second sense. Songs learned once were reproduced perfectly a week later. Conversations overheard at 5 were retold at 7 with details others found remarkable. She could recite events from 2 years back and name who was present, what they wore, what the weather had been. By 6, she could repeat long passages verbatim. By 8, she was, as one housekeeper would later say, an archive walking. Martha, the head housekeeper, noticed what the others sometimes dismissed as mere trickery. Martha had survived in the impossible spaces of plantation domestic life by decoding when to speak and when silence would save more than comfort. She had spent 30 years balancing usefulness and discretion. She watched Eliza and understood the risk. In a world that required enslaved people to appear less than they were, intelligence was both exploited and feared. A servant who remembered too well could become a liability to the men who were used to having their confidence be as unremarkable as the silver they polished. One late July evening, when the house had settled and cicadas kept opinionless time, Martha went to the quarters and whispered to Sarah. "That child remembers too much," she said. "I watch her. She hears something once, she got it forever. I see her tell Miss Harwell about a conversation from 2 weeks back. Remembered every word exact." Sarah felt the old fear she had carried since Eliza's birth tighten around her chest. "What you saying I should do?" she asked. "Teach her to forget," Martha answered in the way you teach a bird to hide its brightest feathers. "Make her ask twice when she heard it clear. Make her look slow. Don't let them know she remembers." So Sarah taught her daughter to underplay the talent that might save her, a bitter lesson in self-erasure. Eliza learned to move as if her mind were duller than it was, to hum and to misplace things on purpose. But memory, once seen, could not be fully hidden. Some things, once observed, cleaved into the brain with the stubbornness of a lit match. On an August evening in 1830, the plantation held a dinner for 11 men who arrived in carriages and drank with a confidence that comes from knowing the world bends to you. These were planters and judges, merchants, and a land speculator named Edward Vance. They ate the sort of food a Tennessee landlord might call generous, and spoke of land, credit, and arrangements you would not find in any ledger. Eliza, small and easily overlooked, moved among them, refilling glasses, clearing plates. Martha put her in the room that night deliberately, trusting she would be unnoticed. The men spoke louder as bourbon dissolved caution. Edward Vance boasted of buying the Fuller property for a pittance, of foreclosures arranged through appropriate channels. Judge Thornton laughed without humor when he spoke of dismissing a freedman's case on technicalities. Colonel Harwell outlined a plan: undervalue properties along the Cumberland and make them vulnerable to acquisition through coordinated low bids, manufactured debts, strategic foreclosures. They spoke of Grace Thornahill, a free woman of color who owned 40 acres and refused to sell. They sketched ways to manufacture questions about her father's will, to manufacture debts, to use judges and attorneys as instruments in what one of them termed, with a kind of casual cruelty, appropriate pressure. Eliza stood with a pitcher in her hands, and the conversation folded into her memory like ink into cloth. She was 6, but comprehension came like cold water. She understood then, with the terrible clarity of a child learning the mechanics of cruelty. These men planned not merely to acquire land, but to destroy people who stood between them and profit. She understood that their power was not simply in titles and deeds, it was in secrecy, in the way information was withheld, twisted, or buried. 2 months later, Grace Thornahill's farmhouse burned on a cold October night. She died in the flames. Neighbors said the fire had a speed and intensity that unnerved them. Debts appeared in court records with the efficiency of a machine. Marcus Pedford filed papers. Judge Thornton validated claims. Edward Vance bought the land for far less than it was worth. The Springfield paper printed an obituary and a note of sympathy and moved on. Eliza had heard the men make the plan. She had watched how easily a life could be smothered under the machinery of law and custom. After that night, something in her became a ledger. She organized conversations in her head like accounts. Who owed what judge ruled which way, which deed had been altered, and how. Memory hardened into method. The men of the Springfield Association, an informal network that never existed on paper but met repeatedly at Harwell's house, assumed their speech harmless among the furniture. They did not understand that a child in the corner could become the repository of 2 decades of their quiet crimes. Martha's death in the winter of 1833 was an early, private catastrophe. She died of pneumonia after a bad freeze. The plantation saw to little care and buried her among the enslaved with a simple wooden cross. Her last words to Eliza were a counsel and a benediction. "You got a gift," she told the child, who had already done the work of 10 lives. But gifts can be curses. Some things you speak them too soon, you die with them. Some things you wait, you watch, you learn when the time right. Promise me you'll be smart. Eliza promised. Colonel Harwell, practical and vainglorious in equal measure, had long since learned to exploit the child's memory. By the mid-1830s, he began to place her in rooms where sensitive conversations were had, treating her like a living record he could consult. The men came to the Harwell parlor to make deals they would not put into ink, and Eliza stored every word. As she grew, the ledger in her head expanded. She cataloged manipulated foreclosures, pre-decided court cases, altered wills, arranged marriages for financial advantage, and the interlocking web of mutual favors that bound the 12 men together. There was Harwell the host and magistrate, Thornton the judge, Vance the speculator, Killebrew with his political connections, Samuel Batson who controlled the cotton gin and could skew farmers' earnings, William Greer with access to land records, Thomas Whitley's mercantile credit, Jefferson Cunningham's bank, Henry Cartwright's tobacco warehouse, Daniel Yatesman's legislative reach, Marcus Pedford the lawyer, Alexander Darden who ran the auction house. Each man was a node. Each node made the others possible. The association's power depended on coordination, on information shared and carefully kept out of court files. Eliza knew the system because she had listened to it being perfected. She knew its strengths. She also, slowly, understood its fatal weakness. It demanded secrecy. It functioned only as long as the truth remained something a person might forget or be paid to forget. If those conversations could be remembered and spoken aloud in a court, the web unraveled. Memory, she began to see, could be leverage, and leverage, in the hands of someone who had nothing else, looked a lot like the possibility of escape. The speculation collapsed like a rotten dam. In the summer of 1844, James Harwell, Jr. had placed $20,000 of association capital into a cotton scheme from Memphis that promised profit on the backs of supposed Southern crop failures. The man who sold the story vanished with the money. Losses devoured trust. Men who had decades of quiet coordination found themselves blaming the single most visible weakness: James Jr.'s impatience. Accusations that had been muttered in private became things men said outright. Threats edged the conversation. The ledger of mutual favors began to unravel. Cornered and desperate, James Jr. made the calculation that would prove catastrophic. He could sell land, call loans, solicit more credit, Or he could sell the one living thing the association feared most, the memory who remembered them all. In October 1844, the decision was taken. James Jr. arranged to sell Eliza South, quiet, private, away from anyone who might recognize the unusually observant girl. He contracted a trader, set a price, scheduled a coffle for mid-July the next year. 8 months stretched ahead like a noose. For most people, that timeline would have been the end. For Eliza, it became the frame of a plan. Where others saw only impossibilities, she had seen, for years, the means by which men in power achieved impossible ends. Small acts of secrecy, strategic leverage, the patient accumulation of details. She would use their methods against them. The first task was literacy. Reading had been a ghostly, stolen habit. Seeing letters by chance in the parlor, repeating scripture fragments heard at the mistress's Bible readings. Writing demanded tools and privacy. She practiced with charcoal on wooden boards wiped clean before morning, traced letters in hearth ash when cook-fire embers dimmed, drew loops and lines in dirt that could be smoothed away. By March 1845, she could form letters and compose simple words. Each line she made was a quiet theft of agency. She needed someone outside Robertson County's interlocking network to believe her. Providence arrived at dusk in the person of Reverend Thomas Walsh, a circuit preacher from Nashville who came for revival and lodged at the Harwell house. When Eliza left the folded note on his pillow, she knew the odds were long. The letter was sparse, written with patient care, a promise of specific, verifiable information, an invitation to meet beneath the oak at dawn. It asked for discretion and for an ear willing to risk trouble. Walsh found the note and found Eliza. She tested him not with abstract claims, but with the exact texture of his own sermon, the thunderstorm detail, the precise Bible verses, the cadence of his closing prayer. She recited his sermon verbatim for 37 minutes. The preacher heard his own voice return to him like an echo of something he had not known he needed to hear. He believed her. Belief moved like a seed the preacher planted in Nashville. Walsh carried her claim to people who operated in a different world than Springfield's parlor. Lawyers, abolitionist sympathizers, editors who wanted a corruption story that cut through the complacent myth of Southern respectability. Money was raised quietly. Legal strategies were sketched. Shelter was offered under the care of sympathetic guardians in Davidson County. They would not speak about gains or motives. What mattered was the instrumentality of the act. Buy freedom, create legal protection, and give the woman who remembered a lawful platform. On July 12, 1845, the papers were signed. James Jr., eager for immediate cash to salve recent humiliations, took the offer from Samuel Porterfield, who represented a religious society with funds discreetly gathered in Nashville. The sum, more than the trader had promised and paid at once, bought legal manumission processed under Davidson County jurisdiction, where the Harwell name held less sway. In a legal formality that read like a theft undone, Eliza Harwell became Eliza Porterfield for a day on paper, and then simply Eliza again. A free woman walking into a city that had the authority to shield her. News traveled back to Springfield like a slow, rising wind that smelled of rain the men had never learned to predict. Panic assembled itself into a meeting at the Harwell house on July 18th. 12 men who had long assumed consequence could be outrun gathered under one roof and found the air thin. Someone had purchased the one living archive of their secret agreements. They could not buy her back. She had been legally emancipated. Their voices, historically measured and confident, were now sharpened into urgent, small-bore scheming. They considered legal challenges to the manumission, technical attacks on jurisdiction, quiet offers to repurchase silence. The more reasonable among them knew the limits of such options. A free woman under Nashville protection could not be easily removed without drawing scrutiny and publicity. The very secrecy they had relied upon would now work against them. Any violent or clandestine attempt to silence a citizen under another county's protection would invite exactly the attention they feared. For the first time in 20 years, they found themselves boxed by the machinery they had used for others. What followed in the months after was a cascade of litigation that spread like frost through spring wheat. The first formal case to test the power of an unpapered memory came from the heirs of Grace Thornhill. Her land had been seized after the 1830 fire that killed her. The foreclosure rested on documents and court decisions arranged, the heirs alleged, by the association. In September 1845, in Davidson County, with Eliza under protection, her testimony opened a door the men had believed locked. Objections rose immediately. Could the spoken recollection of someone who had once been enslaved be admitted against white men in property suits? Had her memory not been shaped, coached, or corrupted by abolitionist hands? The defense demanded to know how any human could recall exact phrases from 15 years before. The court, persuaded by the fact of her legal freedom and by counsel who saw the evidentiary value in a witness with demonstrable recall, allowed her to testify. To prove her accuracy, the judge had Eliza reproduce from memory statements uttered in court 2 days earlier. She did, with a fidelity that stunned clerks and stenographers. She then delivered a testimony threaded with dates, amounts, and phrasing. The August night where the plan to take Thornhill's land had been discussed. The exact phrases used to describe manufactured debts. The names of men who would sign papers, and the way Judge Thornton had laughed and promised to apply pressure when necessary. Where public records remained, her recollection matched. Where records had been conveniently lost, the pattern of losses itself corroborated her account. The court ruled in October. The Thornhill property had been taken on fraudulent pretenses, and the land should be restored to the heirs with damages. For a brief, incandescent moment, reparation flickered in the county's courtroom. But the Thornhill victory was not an isolated miracle. It was an opening salvo. Once one set of fraudulent papers had been exposed, others followed. Farmers whose lands had been purchased cheaply after engineered foreclosures filed suits. Families stripped by manipulated wills sought restoration. Bankers and warehousemen found their accounting practices pulled into scrutiny so precise that audits uncovered the patterns Eliza had long cataloged in silence. Each testifying moment laid another filament across which legal pressure traveled. The dominoes fell unevenly. Some men faced criminal investigations. Others lost businesses and reputations. Edward Vance's speculative holdings unraveled, his acquisitions reclaimed in court or sold to meet judgments. Jefferson Cunningham, once the county's banking master, saw auditors pick through loan files with an exactness that made foreclosure practices and structured terms look less like business strategy and more like deliberate entrapment. Samuel Batson's gin was sued by dozens of cheated farmers. Court-ordered audits exposed systematic shorting on weights and prices. William Greer lost his post in the land office after sufficient evidence tied him to falsified surveys and records. Marcus Pifford, the association's legal architect, found himself professionally exposed. He lost standing and faced disbarment. Some men left Tennessee to live under other names. Others stayed to find that courthouse doors they had once used as tools became thresholds across which judgment passed. The pattern that had protected them Mutual silence, verbal bargains that left no written trace, became their fatal flaw. Each man's secrets were interlaced with another's. Pulling at one thread revealed a web. Eliza's testimony did not always yield criminal conviction. The legal system, even when shown its own rot, could still shelter those with counsel and influence. Mistrials and acquittals occurred. Judges defended precedent. But public ruin came as surely as legal penalties. Land was lost to judgments. Fortunes were spent on defense. Social standing evaporated under headlines that narrated an elite's seamier workings. Change in the county's power structure followed not because law had become moral, but because the trust that had sustained the association had been burned away by exposure. The legal struggle culminated in a consolidated trial in the spring of 1847, a public reckoning in Nashville that knit together charges of conspiracy, falsification of records, and bribery. The courtroom brimmed with men who had once been untouchable, and a public eager to see what the law would do when the accused were the men who had written the law to suit themselves. Eliza testified for 6 days. She sat in the witness box and in that steady, unadorned voice, laid bare 2 decades of plans. She named specific conversations and recalled phrasing so exact that defense counsel charged impossibility and suggested manipulation, invoking everything from doubts about memory to crude insinuations that a woman's body marked by heterochromia could be read as unstable. The judge had doctors examine her, had her repeat contemporaneous statements to show accuracy, had clerks verify dates and filings where they remained. The public watched as an improbable instrument, a memory cultivated in silence and threat, was measured against the very institutions designed to obscure wrongdoing. When the verdicts came in June, some men were found criminally culpable in ways that stripped them of office. Others escaped the full force of the law, but lost everything else. The association as a functioning network was gone. What they had held most dear, reputation, access, the private coordination that turned legal structures into tools of private gain, collapsed under the weight of testimony and the modest, relentless machinery of courtroom scrutiny. And yet ruin did not feel cleansed. The trials left stain and emptiness on both sides. Families uprooted, children bearing names people would later change, properties sold and resold, some lines ending in obscurity. The public's utter astonishment at what one woman's memory had undone turned quickly into a story told in parlors as a kind of curse. The woman with 2 different colored eyes had brought down a power that had seemed immovable. But the rumor was only half the truth. What had felled those 12 families was not supernatural vengeance. It was the terrible and simple fact that a system predicated on secrecy and contempt for human memory could not withstand the sudden illumination of precise, verifiable recollection. Eliza had not needed a curse. She needed patience, a network of unlikely allies, and the legal breathing room to speak. When she did, the kingdom of carefully arranged, mutually protected abuses unraveled. Her testimony had ended, but the aftermath was only beginning. What remained to be told, how she lived in the years after the trials, what became of the families and the county, what traces of scandal survived fires and faded ledgers, would take more time and a quieter kind of reckoning. Eliza's public work was finished by the summer of 1847, but the consequences of what she had set in motion traveled outward for decades, rippling through families that had once imagined themselves permanent fixtures of Robertson County's order. And she, who had stood in packed courtrooms speaking truth with the steadiness of someone finally permitted to breathe, withdrew into a quieter life. Not from fear, but from an exhaustion that only years of vigilance can produce. After the last trial adjourned in June 1847, she did not return to Robertson County. Nashville, with all its complexities and dangers, offered something Springfield never could: anonymity. The Tennessee Anti-Slavery Society, which had quietly backed her emancipation and supported the legal battles, set aside a small sum for her to begin again. It was not comfort, it was not wealth, but it was enough. Enough to live, to work, to exist beyond the reach of men who once considered her a tool, a possession, a harmless witness incapable of recognizing the weight of their words. Records from those years feel like grains of memory scattered on a table. A census entry here, a school ledger there, the brief mention of a woman with mismatched eyes observed in a courtroom gallery. They never quite join into a single portrait, but what they suggest is a life she shaped deliberately, purposefully, to be her own. In September 1849, she married David Porter, a carpenter who had earned his own freedom 6 years earlier. The marriage is recorded without flourish, without commentary, merely names, a date, and the confirmation of witnesses who stood with them. Together, they built a household modest in means, but anchored in stability. 3 children followed: Sarah, born in 1850, who carried her grandmother's name into classrooms where she taught; Thomas, born in 1852, inheriting his father's trade; and Elizabeth, born in 1855, who would live well into the new century, long after the world that had shaped her mother had collapsed into textbooks and suppressed memory. Eliza worked as a laundress for much of her life, according to the census ledgers that survived. The work was grueling and constant: hauling water, scrubbing fabric in winter cold, smoothing garments for families who would never imagine the history folded into the hands that washed their clothes. Yet this occupation gave her what the plantations never had: her own hours, her own earnings, her own house to return to at dusk. She did not work in the homes of the powerful. She did not place herself where her mismatched eyes might be recognized by someone who remembered the scandal and wished to dredge it back to life. Nashville's free black community sheltered her simply by allowing her to blend into its daily rhythms. Still, the world had a way of calling on her. In the 1850s, certain property cases in Davidson County reference an unnamed witness, a woman whose testimony provided historical detail about transactions long obscured by incomplete records. The transcripts, when they mention her, describe a woman with unusual eyes, whose recall of old conversations startled even seasoned attorneys. She never sought these cases. They arrived like half-faded echoes of the past, and when her knowledge could right a wrong, she stepped briefly into the light, offered what she remembered, and then retreated again into her private life. The 12 families did not recover. Their names, once spoken with a deference that bordered on ritual, became burdens their descendants hurried to shed. Robert Killebrew's descendants adopted the name Kilbourne and fled north into Kentucky. Yatesman's children moved to Alabama, building new lives under a softened version of the old surname. Whitley's son traveled west to St. Louis after selling the family mercantile at a loss. And some lines simply ended, shaded out by scandal, bankruptcy, disease, or the quiet decision to leave Tennessee's soil behind forever. Others died in obscurity. Alexander Darden, who once ran the Springfield auction house with the cold efficiency of a man handling grain, died penniless in 1849. Henry Cartwright, whose warehouse controlled the fate of countless farmers, left Tennessee for New Orleans and succumbed to yellow fever in 1853. Their obituaries, when they existed, said nothing of the cases, the trials, the voices that dismantled their authority. History often leaves out the reasons powerful men fall, preserving only the fact that they did. Robertson County itself shifted and strained. New settlers arrived. Old lands were divided and sold. But the soil did not forget, even if the courthouse did. For in 1891, long after the scandal had dimmed from living memory, a fire consumed a wing of the courthouse where the oldest records were kept. It burned for hours in the early morning dark, devouring boxes and ledgers that held testimony, depositions, written echoes of voices long silenced. The cause was declared undetermined, possibly accidental, the way causes often are when no one wishes to dig deeper. Some historians argue it was simply an old building meeting a predictable fate. Others note that the documents lost were precisely those that carried the stain of the old association, records some families quietly wished would disappear. No proof survived, just the fire and what it chose to consume. What remains of the scandal now is not a full narrative, but a fractured one, assembled from what the flames overlooked. Newspaper clippings, stray court rulings filed in other counties, recollections passed down in families that still wonder how their ancestors lost everything in the years of the trials. The fragments are enough to suggest a truth even the fire couldn't finish burying. Some have tried to revise the story, claiming Eliza's memory was exaggerated, that she was used as a weapon by political factions who needed a symbol. But the pattern of collapse, 12 families unraveling in concert, cases decided in courts predisposed to protect the powerful, argues otherwise. Memory can be doubted. Records can burn. But ruin leaves its own kind of evidence. Eliza left no letters, no diary, no memoir. She entrusted her memories to her own mind and to the spoken word, never to the page. Whether she wanted to protect herself or simply refused to relive what she had endured is unknown. In the absence of her own voice, people filled the gaps with theories, embellishments, suspicion, reverence, but the truth remained stubbornly simple. She had remembered what others thought she could not, and she had spoken when silence was expected of her. Her life ended quietly on August 14, 1873, during a late summer pneumonia that even Nashville's doctors could not reverse. She was 49. Her death certificate, one of the few documents that bear her full name, rests now in a drawer of archival files most people will never open. She was buried in the section of the city cemetery set aside for the Black Dead, her grave marked with a wooden cross that has long since rotted back into the earth. No stone remembers her. The plantation where she was born was carved into parcels and sold to people who knew nothing of the conversations once spoken in its dining room. Time took the barns, the sheds, even the main house. Children now play on land where she once carried water and secrets in equal measure. Yet the absence of monuments does not mean the story is gone. In the quiet places of Middle Tennessee history, where the official accounts thin out and the gaps begin to whisper, her memory lingers. A woman with two different colored eyes who dismantled an empire with nothing more than the truth she carried in her mind. They called it a curse because curses are easier to believe than consequences. They called her gifted, or dangerous, or touched by something uncanny. But the truth is harsher. Men who thought themselves untouchable built their fortunes atop secrecy and abuse, and then spoke freely in front of someone they believed had no voice that mattered. She remembered, and when she finally stood where she could be heard, the truth became fire enough. Tell me, when you look at her story now, do you believe everything unfolded as the records suggest? Or do you think there are still pieces missing, buried deep in the soil of Robertson County, or lost to the courthouse fire? Share your thoughts below. And if stories like this, heavy, impossible, unforgettable, hold your attention, subscribe, turn on notifications, and pass this story along to someone who loves the darker corners of history. Until next time, remember, what the powerful hope will be forgotten is often exactly what refuses to die.